pharmacy smelled the same as it always did, antiseptic and something faintly floral, like someone had sprayed air freshener to cover up the fact that most people who came in were sick or scared or both. I was neither that Tuesday. I was just tired. My hip had been acting up since the cold front rolled through Knoxville, and I'd driven myself to the CVS on Kingston Pike to pick up my blood pressure medication, because my daughter-in-law had offered to do it, and I'd said no thank you before she even finished the sentence. That's what our relationship had become, me saying no thank you to things I might have actually wanted, just to avoid owing her anything. I took a number and sat in one of the plastic chairs near the consultation window. The woman next to me was holding a baby on her lap, bouncing it gently, her eyes somewhere else entirely. I watched the number display tick forward. Mine was 38. They were on 29. That's when the man sat down on my other side. He was older than me, which doesn't happen much when you're 63. White hair cut close, a corduroy jacket that had seen better decades, reading glasses folded in his breast pocket. He looked like a retired school teacher, or a judge, someone who had spent a long time listening carefully to other people. He didn't say anything at first, just sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the number display the same way I was. Then he turned to me and said quietly, like he was commenting on the weather, "You live out on Millbrook Road, don't you? The house with the stone mailbox." I looked at him. "I do." "I thought so." He nodded slowly. "I used to fish the creek behind that property. Your husband let me. Years ago." He paused. I was sorry to hear about Edward. My husband had been gone for 4 years. It still caught me off guard when strangers mentioned him. "Thank you," I said. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small envelope, the kind that comes with a florist's arrangement. He held it out to me. "He asked me to give you this. A while back. Said I'd know when the time was right." I stared at the envelope. My name was on the front in Edward's handwriting. I would know that handwriting anywhere. The way he made his capital A's, the slight backward lean of the letters. My throat closed up. "When did he?" "About 6 months before he passed." The man stood up. His number had been called. Or maybe it hadn't, and he just knew it was time to go. "He was a good man. You take care of yourself now." He walked to the counter, and I sat there with the envelope in my lap, not opening it. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready in the pharmacy with the fluorescent lights and the baby next to me and the pharmacist calling out names in a bored voice. I put it in my purse and waited for number 38 and drove home on autopilot, the way you do when your hands know the road better than your mind does. I didn't open it that night either. I set it on the kitchen table and made myself a bowl of tomato soup and watched the news and went to bed. I told myself I needed to be in the right state of mind. Really, I was just afraid. My son had called that afternoon while I was still at the pharmacy. I let it go to voicemail. He and his wife had been calling more than usual lately, several times a week, sometimes together, sometimes separately, always with questions. Had I thought any more about the offer? Had I talked to a financial advisor? Did I understand what the property taxes were going to look like next year? The property they were asking about was the 3 acres on Millbrook Road. The house Edward had built the year before we got married, that we'd moved into together, that our son had grown up in, that I had no intention of selling to a developer or anyone else for as long as I was alive to say so. The offer had come through my son, not directly. He framed it as advice, as concern. A developer named someone or other wanted to buy up several parcels in that stretch of the county, and the money being discussed was significant, enough to set me up comfortable, my son had said. Somewhere smaller, easier to manage. He'd said this while standing in my kitchen, which I manage perfectly well, looking out the window at the back field with an expression I hadn't been able to read. His wife had nodded along. She was always nodding along, but her eyes were doing something else. I had said no. The first time, the second time, the third time. And each time the calls came faster. My neighbor Bet had noticed. Bet lived half a mile down the road and had been watching out for me since Edward died, in the way that certain women of a certain generation just do, quietly and without ceremony. She brought me zucchini from her garden in summer and checked that my gutters were clear in fall. She didn't ask questions. She just showed up. It was Bet who told me, one evening in early March when she'd stopped by with a jar of blackberry preserves, that she'd seen a car parked on the access road behind my property 2 weekends in a row. Dark SUV, she said. Tennessee plates. Just sitting there. Probably hunters, I said. Season's over, she said. I opened the envelope that night. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and, beneath it, a small key on a plain ring. The paper was Edward's handwriting again, dated about 4 months before he died, though I hadn't known he was dying then. He had, apparently. Millie, he wrote. I hadn't been called Millie in years. Edward was the last one. If Raymond Oakes is giving you this, it's because he judged the time had come. I've known Raymond since we were boys, and I trust his judgment more than almost anyone's. If he's handing this to you, it means something is wrong, and I'm not there to say so myself. The key is to the lockbox in the floor of the workshop under the third workbench from the door. You know the one. Inside you'll find a folder. Take it to Harold Fitch at Fitch and Delaney on Gay Street before you talk to anyone else, especially before you talk to our son. I had to read the last line twice. My son's name was not written anywhere in that letter. My husband had just said our son and had trusted me to know what that meant and why. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The soup I'd heated up went cold. Outside the windows, the Tennessee hills were just shapes in the dark, the way they are when there's no moon. I thought about the SUV Bet had seen. I thought about the calls. I thought about my son standing in my kitchen, looking out at the field with that expression. Then I got up, got my coat, got a flashlight, and walked out to the workshop. Edward had built the workshop the same year he built the house. It was where he'd gone when he needed to think. He'd putter around in there for hours, making things that didn't need to be made, fixing things that weren't broken. After he died, I'd kept the door locked and hadn't gone in much. It still smelled like him, sawdust and WD-40 and a little bit of pipe tobacco, even though he'd stopped smoking in 1987. The lockbox was exactly where he'd said, under the third bench, set into the concrete floor, covered by a rubber mat. I would never have moved if I hadn't known to look. The key worked. Inside was a manila folder, thick with papers. I brought it inside and read it at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on and a cup of tea I made and then forgot about. Edward, it turned out, had been thorough. The folder contained copies of the deed to the property, our original mortgage documents long since paid off, and a survey done in 2019 that I'd known about. It also contained documents I had never seen. Correspondence between my son and a company called Ridgeline Capital Group, dating back nearly 2 years. Emails printed out, a letter of intent, a preliminary agreement with terms, my son's signature at the bottom, on property that was not his to sign anything about. He had been negotiating to sell my land for almost 2 years, while I was a guest in his house for Christmas, while I was watching his children in the summer, while I was saying thank you for thinking of me and no thank you to the offer. He had signed a letter of intent. He had accepted an earnest payment. The document showed a wire transfer of $30,000 into an account I didn't recognize, likely his wife's name or an LLC, I couldn't tell. And he had apparently assured Ridgeline that the title issues would be resolved within the quarter. I was the title issue. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people imagine it must be some explosion of grief or rage. It wasn't. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a floor you trusted turning out to be hollow underneath your feet, not falling, just the sound of it when you step. I didn't call my son. I didn't call anyone. I went to bed and I lay in the dark and I listened to the house settle, the way old houses do. And I thought about Edward knowing something was wrong and preparing for it, and trusting Raymond Oakes to hand me an envelope at the right moment, and trusting me to walk out to the workshop in the dark and find the key. He had known our son. He had loved him, and he had known him. In the morning I called Harold Fitch. Harold Fitch was 81 years old and had practiced real estate and estate law in Knoxville for 50 years. Edward had used him for the original deed and for his will, and apparently for whatever arrangement had led to that folder in the lockbox. When I said my name on the phone, there was a brief pause, and Harold said, "Mildred, I've been expecting your call. Can you come in this afternoon?" I said I could. His office on Gay Street was the kind that hadn't been updated since the 90s. Dark wood, framed diplomas, a secretary who had probably been with him for 30 years. Harold himself was small and white-haired and moved deliberately, the way very old men do who still have all their faculties and know it. He shook my hand and pointed me to a chair and closed the door. "Your husband came to me in September of 2020, he said, without preamble. He was worried about certain patterns he was seeing. He asked me to help him protect the property." He folded his hands on the desk. "We structured your ownership in a way that makes it effectively impossible to encumber or transfer without your direct, in-person notarized signature. What your son signed with Ridgeline is not a binding agreement. It cannot be. The property was never his to convey." I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. "However," Harold said, and I knew there was a however, "your son has exposed himself to some potential liability, representing to a third party that you have authority to sell property you do not own, and accepting payment on that basis is fraud, not a gray area." He let that sit. "What do I do?" I asked. "That," he said carefully, "is entirely up to you. We can do nothing, and the Ridgeline agreement simply fails to close, and your son has to return the money, and everyone pretends it didn't happen. We can document what occurred and notify Ridgeline ourselves, which terminates the arrangement formally and puts them on notice. Or," he paused, "we can refer the documentation to the Knox County DA's office and let them determine whether a criminal investigation is warranted." I looked out his window at Gay Street below. A woman was walking a dog. A food truck was parked at the corner. The ordinary afternoon going on, not knowing. "Give me a week," I said. It was a hard week. My son called 3 times. I answered twice and kept the conversation short, and said I'd been dealing with some house maintenance things and hadn't felt well. His wife sent me a link to a condo development in Farragut. "Nice place," she said. "Lots of amenities. Some people our age might really thrive in a smaller space." I didn't respond. On the 4th day, something happened that moved my timeline. I was in the backyard in the early evening, just standing by the fence line where the property meets the field, the way I sometimes do when I need to think. I heard the crunch of tires on the access road on the far side of the tree line. I didn't move. Through the trees I could see headlights, then stillness. The same dark SUV Bet had described. It sat there for close to 20 minutes. Then the headlights came on and it backed out and left. That night I called my daughter. She lives in Portland, 2 time zones away, and we talk every Sunday, and I had not told her any of this because I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and I didn't want to blow up her relationship with her brother before I knew. I told her everything. She was quiet on the phone in that way. She has that means she is more upset than she is letting on. And then she said, "Mom, call Harold in the morning." I called Harold in the morning. He filed the documentation with the DA's office that afternoon. He also sent a formal letter to Ridgeline Capital Group informing them that the purported letter of intent had been executed without authority by a party with no ownership interest in the property, that no sale could or would proceed, and that any further contact regarding the property should be directed to his office. Ridgeline responded within 48 hours. They were, it turned out, not entirely surprised. Harold had the sense that this was not the first time something like this had happened with them. They withdrew. The earnest payment, my son's $30,000, became a separate matter. What happened with my son, I am going to tell plainly, without dramatizing it, because the plain version is already enough. 2 detectives came to my house on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after I'd spoken to Harold. They were professional and straightforward. They told me what they were looking into and asked me some questions, and I answered them and gave them copies of the documents from the lockbox. I'd made several sets. Harold had others. They thanked me and left. My son called me that same afternoon. He didn't ask about detectives. He asked if I'd thought any more about the Farragut condos. I said I had, and that I wasn't interested, and that I thought he knew why. There was a long silence. Mom. I found the folder, I said. I know what you signed. I know about the $30,000. The silence after that was different. It was the silence of something ending. I won't tell you we screamed at each other. We didn't. My son is not a screamer, and neither am I. What we were on that phone call was 2 people who both understood that something had broken and was not going to be unbroken, and we each had to decide what to say with that understanding between us. He said he had thought it was the right thing for everyone. He said the property was too much for me to manage. He said the money would have set us both up. I said, the property is mine. Your father built it. I live in it. It was never a question of whether it was too much for me. I said, you took $30,000 from strangers to sell something that wasn't yours. You made that decision alone, without asking me, without telling me, and you continued to make it for almost 2 years while you sat at my table and watched my grandchildren play in my backyard. He didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. The investigation proceeded. I'm not going to detail the legal specifics because some of it is still ongoing, and Harold advises me to be careful about what I say publicly. What I can say is that my son entered into a plea agreement that involved repaying the earnest money to Ridgeline and a period of probation. He did not go to prison. I am still not sure how I feel about that. His wife filed for divorce 4 months later. I don't know the particulars, and I haven't asked. I see my grandchildren. That was the thing I was most afraid of losing, and I was deliberate about it from the beginning. I made clear to everyone involved, including Harold and my daughter, and eventually even my son, that whatever happened between the adults was not going to be used to separate me from those children. My granddaughter is 9. My grandson is 6. They stay with me some weekends. We bake. We walk the property line, and I showed them the creek where their grandfather used to fish with a man named Raymond Oakes. I thought about Raymond for a long time after all of this. I'd asked Harold if he knew how to reach him, and Harold had smiled and said Raymond had moved to Florida some years back, that he'd delivered the envelope as an old promise to an old friend, and that he'd asked Harold to pass along that he hoped I was doing all right. I am doing all right. The house on Millbrook Road is still mine. The stone mailbox Edward built at the end of the drive is still there. In spring, the field behind the property goes gold with wild mustard, and I stand at the back fence in the evening and watch it. I don't know that I will ever fully understand my son's thinking. I've tried. I can see the shape of it, the impatience, the logic that told him the land was just sitting there, that I was old, that eventually it would all have to be dealt with, and why not deal with it now on his terms, for his benefit. I can see the shape of it, and I still can't get inside it enough to understand how you look at your mother and see a problem to be managed rather than a person to be asked. Edward saw it coming. That's the part that stays with me. He loved our son, and he watched him, and he saw something and said nothing to me, maybe because he thought he was wrong, maybe because he hoped he was, and then he went and quietly built me a door to walk through if I ever needed it. A man with reading glasses and a corduroy jacket, fishing a creek 30 years ago. A small envelope. My name in handwriting. I would know anywhere. I think about the moment in the pharmacy when Raymond Oakes sat down next to me. I think about how I almost hadn't gone that day. I'd thought about asking Bet, or waiting until my daughter visited, or just calling in to see if they delivered. I think about how Edward must have known that, too. Must have thought about all the ways the envelope might never reach me, and trusted anyway. I think that's the thing about loving someone for 40 years. You learn which doors to leave open for them, and you trust them to find it. I keep coming back to the rubber mat in the workshop. The way I lifted it without hesitating, like some part of me had always known it was there. Edward never told me about the lockbox. He never said a word, but he knew me well enough to believe I'd find it when I needed to, and that knowledge, that quiet, steady confidence he had in me even after he was gone, is the thing that undoes me most when I sit with the story now. There's a kind of cause and effect in life that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like consequence in the moment. It looks like a man fishing a creek on someone else's land 30 years ago, building a friendship over nothing more than shared mornings and still water. It looks like a woman going to the pharmacy herself instead of asking for help, because some stubbornness in her refused to be managed. It looks like small choices made honestly that accumulate into something that holds when everything else tries to give way. My son made choices too. I've thought about them long enough now to see them clearly without needing to dress them up or tear them down. He wanted the easy version of things. He looked at that land and saw a problem with a dollar amount attached to it, and he told himself a story where he was being practical, even generous. That's what a failure of character looks like from the inside, I think. Not mustache-twirling villainy, but ordinary self-interest dressed up as reason. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't even, in most ways, a bad man. But he let his judgment be overrun by what he wanted, and he made decisions that weren't his to make, and that is its own kind of answer to itself. What Edward did was different. Edward saw the same situation and did the harder thing. He planned quietly, without drama, for a possibility he hoped wouldn't come. That takes a particular kind of intelligence, the kind that isn't about being the smartest person in the room, but about seeing clearly and acting on what you see, even when it costs you something. It cost him something to distrust his own son enough to build a lockbox into the workshop floor. I know that. I felt the weight of it on his behalf. But he did it anyway, because clarity mattered more to him than comfort. And I had to find my own version of that. Sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with a folder of documents I didn't want to be reading. Driving to Harold's office the next morning when some part of me would have rather pretended none of it existed. Making the call to the DA when every instinct I had as a mother said to give my son one more chance to fix it himself. That's the thing about standing your ground. It doesn't feel like strength while you're doing it. It feels like loss. It feels like walking a road you didn't choose and can't get off. But you keep walking because the alternative is letting someone else decide who you are and what you're worth. And I had spent 63 years being worth more than that. The property is still mine. The stone mailbox is still at the end of the drive. And I am still here, which is more than I could say with certainty on some of those nights. I think about what I would tell someone in a similar place. A woman sitting in a plastic chair somewhere, holding something her instincts are telling her matters, not sure what to do next. I would say, trust the envelope. Trust the person who loved you enough to leave a door open. Trust yourself enough to walk through it. The rest will be hard, and it will cost you things you didn't plan to spend. but a life built on what is true is the only kind worth the trouble of defending.